In this lesson, what we're going to be doing is talking about the impact of the Norman conquests on the English legal system. And we'll be providing something of a historical foundation to the Norman conquest in this lesson, and focusing on how this will eventually contribute to some of the more seismic shifts in the English legal system and the establishment of a more codified system of law. This lesson specifically then will be thinking about the Anglo-Saxon period, just a sort of basic recap of the Anglo-Saxon period and the way in which the legal system operated during that period of time. We will then think about Edward the Confessor, as well as the claims to the throne from various different other individuals, the Battle of Hastings and the conquest of England, and then the impact and the socio-political context of the Norman conquest of England. And I think it should just be important to briefly note at this initial juncture that the Norman conquest of 1066 was a pivotal event in English history, and it would be an event that shapes and reshapes the social, political, and legal landscape of the British Isles. Now, it's essential to understand the background leading up to it in order to understand how the Norman conquest had an impact on the English legal system. And so what I'm going to do is begin by taking a brief recap to the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of England, the Anglo-Saxon period. Now, so before the Norman conquest, we see that England was ruled by a number of Anglo-Saxon kings. Now, England as a unified concept begins really with King Aethelstan in around 895 to 939 AD. King Aethelstan is regarded to be the first king to rule over a unified England. Prior to King Aethelstan, you sort of had the rule of the Heptarchy, and you had people, places like Wessex, Northumbria, for example, and so this was not seen as a unified England, although an idea of England still nevertheless existed. Aethelstan was the grandchild of Alfred the Great, whose son Edward the Elder ultimately all had a vision of unifying eventually a more united England. And so King Aethelstan would ultimately come about and achieve that result. By the 11th century, the Anglo-Saxon monarchy had become relatively stable compared to the earlier period that I was speaking about in previous videos, but it was still a kingdom that depended heavily on its relationships with powerful noble families, and also particularly with the Witan. The Witan was the assembly of nobles, clergy, and other influential figures, and they had the role of advising the king. Now, we've spoken about the Witan in previous videos because ultimately the Witan was, while also a political institution, and was ultimately an institution that would advise the king on matters of policy, but would also interject in particular legal disputes and legal issues as well. And so the structure of the Anglo-Saxon legal system would include a conversation about the Witan. Now, the Anglo-Saxon system of governance was both decentralized and somewhat feudal in nature, even though it would be the Norman conquest that brings about the sort of understanding of feudalism that we know of today in a lot more codified and structured and institutionalized setting, which we will get to in future lessons time. There was a sort of decentralized feudal nature associated with the Anglo-Saxon period. While the king held the ultimate authority, much of the administration of the kingdom was delegated to a number of earls as well as thegns. These were known as the lower nobility, and these earls and thegns would do a lot of the administration of England. They would do so from a regional basis, so they would govern over specific regions of the country. These regions were known as shires, and the king's power was largely based on his ability to control these local leaders and to also control the military forces who the king is supposed to have the command of. Now, if the king does not have the command of the military, then the king is no longer the king, essentially. And this is the sort of way the line of succession takes place throughout the entirety of the Anglo-Saxon period. But like I said, by the 11th century, and by the point at which we see the more formal unification of an England with King Aethelstan, there is definitely more stability than was previously taking place, that previously existed. Now, I want to talk about Edward the Confessor, because Edward the Confessor was an individual who had reigned from 1042 to 1066, and is often described as a particularly pious but also relatively ineffective king. And it is partially the result of this that leads to the eventual collapse of the Anglo-Saxon system in its entirety. He is remembered for his religious devotion, especially his role in the establishment of Westminster Abbey, but his reign itself was marked by several important factors that would contribute to political instability. And political instability, of course, is the ripe conditions that was necessary to allow for the Norman conquest to take place. So, for example, he had quite weak royal authority. He struggled to maintain control over the powerful noble families. The powerful noble families held significant power in the local regions, in the various shires. The system of governance, of course, was highly decentralized, and the nobles often acted in their own interests. And so, in acting in their own interests, they were weakening the king's ability to exercise direct authority, especially when there was a misalignment of interests, where nobles would misalign their interest with that of the king. It really does highlight in those instances the periods of time where there was distinct instability and distinct weakness in terms of monarchical and royal authority. You also have the fact that by the time Edward the Confessor dies in January 1066, there is no heir, and so England is left in a particularly precarious situation. His lack of a clear successor creates a power vacuum, and there is then the question of who succeeds Edward the Confessor. Again, a key issue that eventually contributes to the decision on the part of William the Conqueror, and a decision that eventually leads to the collapse of the Anglo-Saxon period. As was customary then, after the death of Edward in January 1066, the Witan, the royal council, was tasked with the role of selecting a new king. At the time of Edward's death, the Witan chose somebody by the name of Harold Godwinson. Now, Harold Godwinson was the powerful Earl of Wessex and became the new King of England, King Harold, as we know from the famous stories about the Battle of Hastings, as we'll get to in a minute. His reign doesn't last particularly long, let's just say that. Harold was a prominent figure among the Anglo-Saxon elite, and so his selection was in fact quite a popular selection. He was supported by much of the nobility, particularly in southern and central England. Now, there are still, nevertheless, a number of claims to the throne that is not necessarily mentioned at this point. So the question of who would become king was complicated by competing claims. So even though the Witan formally picks Harold Godwinson and the Earl of Wessex, there were claims that came from both England and from abroad, again setting the stage for the Norman conquest. So firstly, of course, Harold Godwinson was the newly crowned king and was the most immediate claimant to the throne. He had he was the most powerful noble of England, being the Earl of Wessex, and he had significant support from the Witan and from the rest of the Anglo-Saxon nobility. Often in a number of these different parts of the world and periods of time, it was basically who was in control of the most powerful people who would be have the best claim to the throne. That's how, for example, in the Russian monarchy, the Romanov dynasty was picked. Mikhail I in 1613, I believe, was picked by the sort of Russian equivalent of the Witan at the time. And so the same kind of thing takes place here. Harold's claim was not entirely unchallenged, however, and you have two prominent figures that also bring about claims to the throne. I'm going to begin first with the person who eventually gets the throne, which is, of course, William, Duke of Normandy. The Duke of Normandy in modern-day France had his own claim to the throne. He gets his claim to the throne because he was the great-nephew of Edward the Confessor through his mother, Emma of Normandy, who had been the wife of both King Ethelred the Unready as well as King Canute the Grey. So there is a deep connection that the Duke of Normandy, William, actually has to the royalty of the Anglo-Saxon period. So, William's claim is based on a promised succession from Edward, according to a story that William himself propagated. So, whether or not that story is true is one for historians to debate. We're not going to get into that in this lesson. The most famous version of the story, at least, is that Edward had promised the throne to William during his visit to Normandy in the early 1050s. Now, additionally, Harold Godwinson is said to have sworn an oath of allegiance to William in 1064, and again pledging his support for William to the throne, although again the specifics of this oath as well as the validity of this oath in general are both disputed facts. But at the very least, William's claim, though supported by a strong military and political network in Normandy, was still nevertheless facing resistance in England that would ultimately lead to battles itself. You also have the third claimant to the throne, Harald Hardrada, who was the King of Norway. Now, his claim to the throne was based on an agreement between his predecessor, King Magnus the Good of Norway, and also the former King of England, who was by the name of Harthacnut. Harthacnut, should I say. Again, trying to pronounce these names is going to get more and more complicated. But ultimately, this agreement that was made between the former King of England and King Magnus of Norway stipulated that if either ruler had died without a male heir, the other would inherit the throne. And so Harald Hardrada claimed that this agreement entitled him to the English crown after the death of Edward the Confessor. Now, he did receive the support of many Norsemen who had settled in England, and there is obviously a very long and storied history about the Viking conquests of England and then the eventual interrelationship and intermingling of these two communities. But at the same time, Hardrada's claim was largely irrelevant, especially when you think about it within the political context of Anglo-Saxon England, because Anglo-Saxon England, from a political perspective, had the point of sovereignty, at least, or the point of authority, should I say, more specifically, was that of the Witan, and the Witan had chosen Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex. So, while Hardrada's claim, nevertheless, may have some kind of validity, at least in terms of succession, or at least in terms of agreement, in terms of the political context of Anglo-Saxon England, it was largely irrelevant owing to the claim made by the Witan. So the situation would increasingly grow to be complex in the months following the death of Edward the Confessor. So Godwinson was crowned king. The Earl of Wessex was crowned king in January 1066. But again, this would then be contested by both William of Normandy and Harold Hardrada. Tensions would then soon escalate into military conflict towards the back end of 1066. And so we have a number of key events that are going to be very important. We have the 25th of September, 1066, the 14th of October, and then the 25th of December, 1066. These are the key events that are important to think about in relation to the eventual Norman conquest of England. The first of these events is the Battle of Stamford Bridge. So this is an event that takes place in the north, in which you see that Harold Hardrada had secured support from Harold's exiled brother, who was Tosig Godwinson. They had invaded England in 1066. Hardrada's army landed in the north and began to march south. They won a number of victories, a key victory being a victory at the Battle of Fulford Gate against the Anglo-Saxon forces. However, King Harold, who is now formally King of England, had been for a few months, quickly gathered an army and marched north to meet this invading force. The two forces met near York at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where there was a decisive defeat of the Norse invaders. Harold decisively won against Hardrada and Tosig, who were both killed in the battle. And so the threat from Norway and the threat from this first claimant to the throne was dealt with immediately. We then get the problem of October the 14th of October. This is the Battle of Hastings, the famous event that obviously begins the Norman conquest. So Godwinson was forced to march south to confront another invasion, this time being William of Normandy. Now bear in mind that a large army in medieval England, is going to take a long time to get from one part of the country to the other part of the country. And here, it is not even a full month that takes place between the Battle of Stamford Bridge and the October 14th Battle of Hastings. And so you have the problem of not only getting rest and recovery from a battle that you've already done, and then to move very quickly back to the south, it leaves Harold particularly unprepared. Now, there is a lot of historiography about the Battle of Hastings, and there are a lot of people who argue that the Battle of Hastings could have in fact been won by Harold, and so you might have even had a situation where you just had the continuation of the Anglo-Saxon period because of this decisive victory. But this, of course, did not happen. William had assembled a large army and fleet, and they had crossed from Normandy across the English Channel, and they landed in Pevensey, in Sussex. This was in September of 1066, and Harold's forces, exhausted after the campaign that was met in the north, had to then meet William's army at Hastings. And so Harold would eventually die at the Battle of Hastings and would be defeated. Harold was killed and was supposedly shot in the eye by an arrow, although the details are uncertain and historians, of course, disagree. And this, in fact, is the period at which we see the collapse of the Anglo-Saxon dynasty, if you will. And the 25th of December 1066 is a very key event because, firstly, it's Christmas Day, but also it is the day that William the Conqueror is crowned and has his coronation at Westminster Abbey. The conquest was far from complete, however, because much of the country remained resistant to the Norman rule, particularly in the north as well as in the west. And so the immediate task of William the Conqueror, just like the task of any king who's taking over the throne and ending a lineage, is to consolidate power. And he would do so through a number of military campaigns and fortifications, and also by redistributing land to loyal followers. This would establish formally the feudal system that we know of in the medieval period. So just like when, for example, Henry VIII goes over in 1485 and beats Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth and establishes the Tudor dynasty, you see that the immediate task of Henry VII is to consolidate power, and he does so through a number of means similar to that of William the Conqueror, by rewarding loyal members and by taxing those who are not loyal and by crushing rebellion. But the same thing has to take place in terms of the Norman conquests. So the political backdrop of the Norman conquest was shaped by several important factors. You have to remember that there was a decline in the royal Anglo-Saxon family. The Godwinson family, led by Harold's father, who was Godwin, Earl of Wessex, had grown immensely powerful by the mid-11th century, but this was not the official lineage that came from Edward the Confessor. This became a lineage that was eclipsing the king's own power. The family itself had been instrumental in placing Edward the Confessor on the throne in the first place, and so their dominance had become a cause of tension at the point of January 1066, at the point at which Edward had died. So the Anglo-Saxon system was in decline even before the taking of the throne by the Godwinson family, by Harold himself, the Earl of Wessex. You also have the fact that there was tension that had been taking place with the Viking world for many years prior to the Norman conquest. By the point at which William the Conqueror takes the throne in 1066, England had been subject to Viking raids and invasions for much of the previous 2 centuries. You have the reign, for example, of King Canute the Great from 1016 to 1035. This had been the established North Sea Empire, which included England, Denmark, and Norway, as well as parts of Sweden. Now, after the death of Canute the Great, England would fall back into further internal political instability. The descendants of Viking kings, such as Harald Hardrada, still maintained that they had a claim to the throne, and the notion of a united and unified Viking Empire was still part of the sort of political zeitgeist of the 11th century. So that is still something that sort of permeated in the background and continued to weaken and to cause further instability to the Anglo-Saxon system. And then finally, you of course have the rise of the Duchy of Normandy, Normandy being a region in France, of course. This had become a very powerful entity under the leadership of Duke William, later to be William the Conqueror. The Normans were originally Viking settlers who would assimilate into French culture, and by the 11th century, they were a major force in European politics. And their military strength and their political ambitions would play a particularly crucial role in their decision to involve themselves in a conflict for the English throne. And so all of this leads to a complete upholding of the social, political, and important for us, the legal system that we see in the English world. And eventually the sort of complex and mixture of dynastic struggles and shifting alliances and competing claims to the English throne would have a very important effect on the way in which society changes and the way in which the legal system would develop in the sort of post-Norman conquest English system. All of this leads to the foundation of the foundation for the major political, social, and legal changes that would follow. And it is the legal changes that would follow that is important for our understanding, because it marks the beginning of both Norman rule as well as the eventual development of the English common law.